Through education, research, scholarships, networking, and more, the institutes are unique in how they help and support insurance professionals, both today and into the future.
Thought Leader Theater is brought to you by the Institutes.
Hello, I'm Mike Elliott from the Institutes. Today I'm going to talk about practical applications of enterprise risk management. I'm going to talk about many of the concepts that are in our Enterprise Risk Management 57 program. We initiated that program with RIMS, and RIMS also helped us develop the program. Let me start off by talking about the evolution of risk management. Back in the 60s and 70s, risk management consisted of mainly insurance management. We were looking at purchasing insurance. Then we evolved to what we called risk management. Risk management involved looking at the retention and transfer of losses. We looked at our losses, we looked at retaining them, and we looked at financing them or how to pay for them. Now we've evolved in the last 10 years or so to enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management, we look at all the risks of an organization. Previously, we just looked at pure risks. In other words, risks where there was no loss or a chance of a loss. Now we look at all the risks that have positive and negative consequences. We also look at enterprise risk management in terms of the objectives of the organization. We also look at it to support strategic decision-making of the organization. Let me read to you the RIMS definition of enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management is a strategic business discipline, that's important, strategic business discipline, that supports the achievement of an organization's objectives, by addressing the full spectrum of its risks. As I mentioned, we're not just looking at pure risk, we're looking at all the risks of an organization, and managing the combined impact of those risks as an interrelated risk portfolio. We're looking at all the risks, we're looking at how they interact with each other, we're looking at risk offsets. Risks move up and down, have positive and negative values, so we look at all of our risks together, and many of them tend to offset each other. Let's look at all the organizational functions that are related to enterprise risk management. We have governance, we have strategic planning, we have performance management, process management, risk management, internal control, and compliance. It's important for an enterprise risk management program to take all these different functions into account. Today we're going to focus on governance, strategic planning, internal control, and regulation and compliance. This is an important slide in terms of looking at enterprise risk management. With enterprise risk management, we have both a framework and a process. And it's important for you to think about what framework you're going to use and what process you're going to use. There are several types of frameworks and processes. This is a generic slide that shows a framework and a process. Now, the framework supports the process. As you'll see in the upper left-hand circle, the blue part, we have lead and establish accountability. It's very important to have a commitment from the top of the organization. I was talking to someone yesterday and they said none of this can come about unless you have top management on board, and that's true. That's what you need. You also need to establish accountability throughout the organization. You need to think about who's going to participate in this process, in the framework, what you're going to do at the board level, how are they going to be involved, how is senior management going to be involved. You also need to think about what your overall risk appetite is for your organization. You also need to think about your risk management policy as well. Now, the second one is align and integrate. And that's where we talk about ERM should be aligned with your strategic objectives. So it's aligning your ERM program with your strategic objectives It's also integrating the program with all of those different functions that we saw in the last slide. Lower right-hand corner is to allocate resources. You need to make sure you have the commitment of resources in order to get the program accomplished. You also need to think about things like if you're looking at risk, investing capital on a risk-based way, then you need to get your CFO involved in terms of calculating the amount of capital you need based on the risk involved. And then the last part is communicate and report. Now, you see on the inside there, you have a process. And that's a standard process. It's similar to the traditional risk management process, but involves a number of steps. And the steps are scan the environment, have ways to identify your risks, to analyze your risk, which often involves things like root cause analysis, ways to treat your risk, what do you retain, what do you transfer, how do you look at your risk in terms of offsetting each other in terms of the results, and of course monitor and assure. They'll plan, do, check, and act. It's a continuous process to plan, do, take actions when you need to, keep checking. Now, there are two main frameworks and processes out there, and I'll just briefly mention them. This is a generic one, but a main one is ISO 31000. And ISO 31000 came out in 2009. It's a global standard. It defines risks as having upside and a downside, so it's clearly in the ERM space. It also has principles, it has a framework, and it has a step-by-step process that is very similar to what we see here on the process inside. The other main standard is COSO, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, and that came out of the financial world. The AICPA, Financial Executives Institute, COSO ERM came out in 2004. And that doesn't have a strict process like the ISO 31000, but it does have components that all interact in terms of things you should do in order to implement ERM. It also focuses on events. It defines risk as an event that can have an adverse impact on objectives. Now, that sounds like pure risk, right? Because it's just talking about adverse impact. However, then it goes on to say that an event can have positive or negative consequences. So it does cover the idea of risk having an upside and downside. It's just a different way of approaching it. Many organizations adopt a combination of ISO 31000 and COSO ERM to meet their own needs. Okay, let's move on to strategy, strategic risk management. Remember I said we're going to talk about 4 different functions? Well, strategic risk management involves, first of all, setting the strategy, SWOT analysis. I'm sure you've all heard of this. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we also have internal and external. Strengths and weaknesses are internal to the organization. Opportunities and threats are external to the organization. There are also other ways to set strategy. There's what's called pestle analysis, which some of you may have heard of, the 5 forces model by Michael Porter. But all these strategic ways to set strategy incorporate risk. They always have. It's just that what we're talking about now is that we're talking about a formal way to infuse risk into the whole process. Let's talk about strategy formulation and implementation. We need to take risk into account when we're formulating and when we're also implementing strategy. Now, as you can see up there, some really important things to do is to determine your strategic objectives, and we talked about the models. Secondly is to determine your risk appetite. How much risk are you willing to take in order to get return? What is your overall corporate philosophy on risk appetite? Really important, should be set at the board level. And then also risk assessment. Look at different scenarios. There's many different ways to assess risk. There's quantitative, qualitative ways to assess risk. And then have your risk-based strategies laid out. Now, after that is the implementation of the strategy, and that involves allocating capital as we said, if we're on a risk-based capital basis, have your implementation plan, execute the strategy, and as always, monitor and control. Okay, let's talk a little bit about risk appetite and tolerance. I mentioned risk appetite in terms of looking at the trade-off between risk and return. How much risk do you want to take for potential return? However, another really important concept is risk tolerance. Risk tolerance means what is the amount of risk your organization is able to take based on the amount of capital resources the organization has. And it's this concept here, when we look at this, we have, let me get my pointer here. We go from low to high in terms of risk. See the red line in the middle. The higher the risk level, the more variability. You see the blue line? We also have RA1 and RA2, and that's risk appetite level 1, risk appetite level 2, as well as we have risk threshold. Now, by risk threshold, we mean the risk tolerance. So it's important to look at our risk appetite in relation to our risk tolerance. If our risk appetite is too high, as shown in RA2, then you can see that we potentially are exceeding our risk tolerance. So we want to lower our risk appetite in that case. We don't want to go beyond our tolerance to a level that we decide the risk return amount is something our organization wants to do. So that's an important concept as a way to look at both risk appetite and risk tolerance. Let's look at organizational levels and strategic risk management. At the strategic level, the top level of the organization, it focuses on risks for a competitive advantage. The board is looking at risk appetite. The board is looking at risk in order to have a competitive advantage for the organization. They have the global view. At the operational level, they tend to focus on risk control and avoidance. They're looking at it from a whole different perspective. They want to control the risk, often they want to avoid the risk. So those two forces push against each other, as you can see there, and what you need to do for your organization is to strike a balance between the two. Okay, let's go on to risk governance. Okay, this happens to be a really good definition of risk governance I happen to like from the Singapore Risk Governance, Corporate Governance Council. And I think it explains it pretty well. First of all, it's the architecture within which risk management operates within a company. And we talked a little bit about the board should be involved and so forth. Well, how's the executive level involved? How's the operational level involved? That's the architecture. What supports risk management? It also gives clarity. It should give clarity about what risks are managed. In other words, it should say these are the important risks for the organization. Maybe these other risks we don't quite need to manage the same way. Can't potentially affect the organization as much. And it also provides guidance for sound and informed decision making. Remember I said enterprise risk management, you're linking back to decision making all the time. So a good risk governance program supports that decision making. Let's look at an ERM governance model. Now, there's different ways, of course, to do governance. However, what this model shows is the board of directors needs to be involved. You see below in blue the board risk committee. Now, some organizations have a separate risk committee, some don't. Sometimes it's mandated. Dodd-Frank mandates it for financial organizations and some non-financial organizations. But your board risk committee could be the audit committee, could be the same group, it could be the entire board, it could be a separate committee. It just varies. It's just important that the board risk committee have access throughout the organization directly to employees, that it be independent. That's an important concept. Now you have the CEO, you have the chief risk officer, and the chief risk officer may chair a different committee called at the executive level. and it has a relationship with the Board Risk Committee, although I said the Board Risk Committee should have a large degree of independence, as well as you have the line managers, and you could have an operational risk committee at that level as well. Okay, we're going to switch from risk governance to internal audit. Let's talk about the evolution of internal audit. And I know we have at least one internal auditor in the room, someone with background in that. But it has evolved a lot, just like risk management has. It's evolved a lot. But it's important for internal audit and risk management to talk to each other and work together. And it's evolved in a similar way. Historically, internal audit was focused on approving transactions, making sure the transactions were correct. And then over time, it evolved. It evolved into assurance of internal controls. In other words, the operational managers develop controls, and then internal audit looks at those controls to see how effective they are and also identifies any gaps. And now recently, internal audit has evolved to a risk-based approach. Sound familiar? It's an approach for allocating resources to looking at risk management for an organization. Now, it's a little bit different internal audit's role because it's based on assurance of internal controls, assuring the board and so forth. But here's a definition of risk-based auditing. Supports an organization's internal control function by aligning audit resources with the areas that pose the greatest organizational risk. Okay, let's talk about risk management and internal audits a little bit more. We'll quickly go through this. They're separate functions. They share a common goal. They're complementary. And they can also, internal auditors can play a very important role in establishing and facilitating your risk management program. Now let's talk about a few common internal control frameworks. Remember, we talked about ERM frameworks before. These are internal control frameworks, which are different. But COSO had one they came out with in 1992, focuses just on internal control. ISO 9000 is a quality management standard, and that also focuses on, it also applies to regulatory compliance. And then you have different countries have done different things, like the Canadian Chartered Accountants. Okay, 3 lines of defense model. Let's go through this quickly. First of all, think about how your risk, what types of defense do you have to make sure there's nothing getting through your risk. The first line of defense is on the left there, and that's operational management. And they look at they develop the internal controls. Second line of defense is the risk management department that makes sure that the operational units are following the risk management guidelines and so forth. Third line of defense can be considered internal audit. As we said, internal audit looks at the assurance of the adequacy of the controls and assures the board as to the adequacy of the controls. And we can look at external audit as a 4th line of defense as well, even though this is called the 3 lines of defense model. Let's look at compliance and regulation as well. Compliance and regulation. Make sure you understand what your compliance department does, what your regulation department does. Look at the different ways that compliance and regulation are done. In other words, there's rules-based compliance, more certain, but it can be circumvented. Whenever I think of rules-based compliance, I often think of generally accepted accounting principles or statutory accounting principles that we have in our business. In other words, these are the rules, here's what you're supposed to do. Principles-based is more flexible, responds more quickly. It focuses on outcomes. It just says, this is what we want for the outcome. You have a lot of leeway in terms of doing this. It requires a lot more communication between regulators, the regulator, and the regulated. Now, when I think of principles-based compliance regulation, I think of international accounting standards, because that's much more principles-based. We also have for insurance companies a new requirement this year, ORSA, O-R-S-A, Own Risk and Solvency Assessment, and that is principle-based, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, again, think about the roles of compliance and internal audit in your organization. Compliance determines compliance issues, puts together plans to meet compliance requirements, does compliance risk assessments, internal audit, and audits the controls that test for compliance, identifies gaps, and serves as an internal consultant. Okay, NEIC ORSA. I mentioned that a minute ago. That's own risk and solvency assessment. The National Insurance Commissioners put together a model act on this. And a number of states have passed the model act. It's for insurance companies. It's for large insurance companies. You need over $500 million in gross written premium in order to have to fill out an ORSA summary statement. But it's a really great example of ERM applied to insurance companies. It's principles-based, as we talked about. There's a guidance manual, but the insurance company is supposed to report on its ERM program. And the guidance manual has a number of concepts, like we just talked about, like risk governance, like risk appetite, and so forth. And the insurance company puts together its ORSA manual, and they're doing that this year. There's a number of people who are saying that this will really strengthen ERM with insurance companies. So those are the concepts I want to cover today. Do I have any questions? Any questions at all? Okay. Thank you very much.